Recording now. And we're gonna take questions if we have time, or if you think of questions, throw them up in the chat, because we'd love to see your questions, because we might be able to answer some of them today as we're going, or it might be something that we can follow up on next week.
Yes,
we're doing this weekly.
I mean, we're at least going to do this for a few weeks. So
yes.
I mean, this is, no matter what, it's happening right here, right now.
So I guess we can just get started. It's 3:16. We said we were going to start at 3 o'clock or 3:15. So let's just get started. So welcome everybody to Let's Talk Coronavirus. This is brand new territory for me and Ron, but I'm Rachel Bergstrom, and Ron, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, and I'm Ron Watson, and I am an associate professor in political science and health and society, our public health major.
And I'm an associate professor in biology and health and society. And Ron and I like to think a lot about the complexities of health. And we were thinking about, so I teach emerging diseases, and this is like a masterclass in emerging disease, let me tell you. And so we were thinking about how do we reach out beyond just our classrooms to bring in other people who are interested in this, and to start to get a broader perspective on the current pandemic. And so today, as you might be aware, we have a famous person joining us, President Scott Bierman, who is also an economist. Scott, would you like to say hi?
Hello, everybody. Good to have everybody here. Great to be with you, Ron and Rachel.
Right on. It's good to have you, Scott.
Great. And I guess I just jumped on Ron. I said that Ron was going to introduce you, but
no, that's all good. We don't. Agendas be damned.
Yes. So our plan for our talk today is, or for our time together today, is that we'll welcome your questions. We've got a number of questions that were submitted from my class that we can always talk about. Scott has some questions for us. But as we're doing this, we welcome you to either email us your questions or send them in the chat. You can send them to everyone, or you can send them directly to one of us. What we'll do with those questions is keep track of them. And if we can answer them in real time, we'll do that. If we can't, we'll add them to our agenda for next time. Yep. But we do also want to start with a little, everybody is kind of experiencing a lot of change in their lives. So to humanize this all, we wanted to talk a little bit about how we've been coping. So Ron, what have you been doing to keep yourself sane and healthy these days? Yeah,
I mean, it's a good question. Eating a lot. I'm not sure if that keeps me sane. I'm not sure about the healthy part. But, it's a natural reaction, as you all know, right, to stress. I also have a toddler here because daycare closed. So, yeah, my wife and I have been, we've got a lot motivating us to stay happy and moving forward. But beyond that, also just doing things that I enjoy. Like, I enjoy playing video games. I've been a gamer since I was a kid, so I do that. And also reconnecting with my friends. I've had a few friends, one who's in Hawaii right now, and then another one who's in Malaysia. And recently we've been sort of reconnecting and talking to each other. And that's been great too, and reminding me again of why that's important, right? Especially in times like this.
Yeah, I think that I have spent more time on the phone and FaceTime over the past week or so than I ever have in my whole entire life before. I mean, aside from all the Zoom meetings, of course. But so I also have a toddler at home, and so that's been a transition. But I'm actually finding I was terrified. I got to be real honest with you people. I was terrified about being home all day long with the toddler, but it's been wonderful in some ways and terrible in some ways too. So, but I took up embroidery. Oh, let's see if you can see. So you can maybe see it there. So I've taken up embroidery, which is a nice way to pass the time in Zoom meetings when I need to be present, but not too present. Um,
And now we know when you're sitting there going like this, now we know what's happening. Gotcha.
Yep. So, and I'm also a runner, and the nice part about this safer at home situation is that I've been able to still get out and run. So, Scott, what have you been up to?
Yeah, it's been a challenge. This part is real, and to your point, Rachel, you give me some good ideas. But a hefty chunk of my life is Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, and that's not a healthy way to go through life. So I will look forward when the pace of those meetings declines some. So it may surprise you to know that I also have a toddler at home. So it turns out that I have a granddaughter who had been living in the New York City area, and they escaped New York to come spend the next month, whatever, in Wisconsin. And so I have a 2-year-old that's running around our house. So
Wow.
it's great. I mean, it is by far and away the best part of my day is escaping my Zoom meetings and going and hanging out with my granddaughter. And this is a on-campus moment, but of things that she absolutely loves, it's the chiming of the bells in the chapel. So she'll run to the door as soon as she hears the first bell, and we have to run to open it so that she gets to hear the bongs of whatever hour it is that it's chiming. So that's a great moment. And like Rachel, I try to get out and run, and like both of you, connecting with students and faculty and staff, friends, and just checking in on each other is just part of the sanity equation.
Yeah, right on.
Right. Yeah, well, we can all, share toddler war stories next year when we get there. So, because we will get there. So, we'd like to dive directly into some of the material that we want to talk about, because there is so much.
Yes.
And so, Ron and I wanted to start out with some like contextual questions. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the virus and give you some context on that. And we have a lot of resources that maybe it might be useful for us to put together a Google Doc of things to share in the future. And then Scott's got some questions for us that we'll start the conversation with. But I wanted to point out right behind me here, this is coronavirus. This is what is causing all of the problems right now. And some things to know about viruses, if you're not familiar with viruses, they are technically not alive. Viruses are what we call obligate intracellular pathogens, or parasites, sorry, meaning that they have to be inside a cell that is going to do all of the work of making copies of it. And so when you're infected by a virus, really what you are doing is you are being the machinery that the virus needs in order to make copies of itself. Mm-hmm. So there's some really important things for us to be aware of about coronavirus as an RNA virus. So we have 2 different versions of genetic material that can be used by viruses. We have DNA, which is like what we have in our cells. So that's deoxyribonucleic acid, and you probably have seen like the double-stranded helix situation. That's really stable, and making copies of DNA, there's a lot of spell checking in making the copies. And so when we think of DNA viruses, we think of like things like smallpox that are pretty stable. We don't have a lot of risk of mutations for those types of virus. Then we have viruses like COVID-19 and influenza that are both RNA viruses. And when our cells make copies of RNA from an RNA template, so that's a single-stranded RNA. I believe that this is, now I'm second guessing myself, but this is an RNA virus. Anyhow, we'll leave it at that. When a cell is making copies of RNA viruses, there's a lot more possibility of mistakes being made. And those mistakes can lead to mutations. And the good news is that the vast majority of the mistakes that are made when the virus is making a copy, or when your cells or whoever's cells are making a copy of the virus, the vast majority of those mistakes mean that those viruses are not competent to go on and infect another cell.
Right.
And so, so we definitely worry about mutations with this particular virus because it's an RNA virus, just like we worry about mutations with all sorts of different RNA viruses, because it means that there are different ways that we think about treating it. The good news is that I was listening to NPR the other day, and they had a report talking about this very particular question about mutation in COVID-19. And we found very low mutation rates across a lot of cases that we had. Sorry, I've got a dashboard up here that I think we're almost at 500,000 cases reported so far.
Mm-hmm.
And the virus is looking pretty stable, which means good things for us in terms of potentially building immunity and potentially being able to develop a vaccine. And so that's some of the virus basics. There's of course a ton more, and we're learning more every single day. And another one of the podcasts that I've been listening to said, all right, it is Wednesday, March 25th at 3:27 p.m. There's a good chance that half of the things that I tell you right now are going to change.
Yes.
So we got to include that. But anyhow, so that's a little bit about the virus. Ron, your turn.
Yeah. So one of the things that's been interesting for me in this whole epidemic is thinking through some of these questions actually that your students sent in. They really do get at the heart of many things that have been on my mind. For one thing, people keep asking like, well, how long until this pandemic is over, right? And then how are we going to come up with a vaccine? The vaccine part is not so hard. It just takes time. And there's already a great deal of work happening on that. And the real issue is how long will it last? And that's the thing that I keep telling folks, is that we have to recognize that this is called a novel coronavirus, right? We don't know if it's seasonal yet. We don't know if it's something that is just going to be endemic and we have to live with. There's a lot we don't know. Someone else asked the question, why is it that this doesn't seem to really affect infants or small kids? Well, it does affect some infants, but it seems that school-age children, for the most part, are somehow not immune, but it doesn't seem to affect them, meaning like 5 to like 8, that range. No one knows why at this point. And those are the questions that sort of are keeping me up, right? Because one of the things I'm doing is I'm paying attention to this, is I'm saying, when I start seeing this really deeply affect beyond the population that we know it affects, that's when I think my concern level is going to kick up to like level 5, right? It's at level 3 right now, right? Where it's like, oh, we got to social distance, we got to do these things to protect people around us. But that's sort of where my attention has been on this. But a lot of people are asking this question, and there's so many unknowns and there's so much uncertainty. I think that's probably what's fueling a lot of what people are feeling. But right now, we don't know, but at least it does seem to be, as Rachel has pointed out, a fairly stable virus. And that is good. That's good for so many reasons. So.
Well, great. So Scott, have at it. What sorts of things are you thinking about? What sorts of questions do you have for us?
Right. Well, on the front side of this, of course, I'm concerned primarily about the health implications, but those health implications translate quickly into economic implications.
Yeah, sure.
And among the things that we know is that those economic implications translate back into health implications. So these are not independent things of things that matter enormously to the physical health of a population is the economic health of that population. So this is linked. So trying to understand, we've watched, everybody knows about the impact on the stock market and the ways in which this right now is having minimally a dramatic short-run impact on the economy, and the large amount of layoffs, the bill that was just passed by the Senate is going to impact that. So, much on my mind is connected to something that at least I know a little bit about, which is the economy. But backtracking, and so people may have questions about that, for which I can do my best at trying to offer a perspective. But back to the virus itself and COVID right now. Ron, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you see the impact of COVID having differential impacts on different communities within the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Scott. I think primarily the impact that I see is the one you've already started to address, which is this sort of economic impact of this crisis. We've already seen any number of layoffs, and some of the best advice coming from some economists is, hey, whatever you do, companies, don't lay people off. I mean, do time sharing where you cut people's hours and do something, but don't lay people off. For the reasons that you already pointed out, is that there's a very powerful psychological effect of being unemployed, and especially being laid off. And that effect then has its own sort of knock-on impact on people's physical health. And so my concern, another of my concerns, is that we're going to see folks in those communities that were already sort of hard hit or largely had service-oriented jobs. We're going to see those folks impacted the most. And that's, in some respects, that's no surprise. But one of the places where I'm actually hopeful is that this stimulus package, especially if it does completely go through, and hopefully it will, that will at least provide some relief. And I've also been one of those people thinking that while we should have as much as possible a very strong package for individual folks, sure enough, small business needs to be a fairly good target of this. Many of the folks that we are concerned about work for small businesses, and small businesses are of course, the least able to financially weather this sort of prolonged disaster. So yeah, from my perspective, Scott, when I look at the communities, how different communities will be affected, I think that unfortunately we'll see an all too familiar sort of class socioeconomic gradient to this. But I'm hopeful that this stimulus package can at least buffer folks a bit more than they would have otherwise, right? I mean, we don't imagine that folks were not particularly buffered during the 2008 financial crisis. And at least this is a little bit different in that respect, I hope.
Yeah, I hope you send a thank you note to whatever economics professors you had in your past, Ron. So, well done. Rachel, this is a virus in what is a long history of new viruses, and we can fully expect other viruses that to arise for which we don't have an immunity or any sort of inoculation going forward. How does our thinking about COVID-19 right now, how does that sort of help us understand how we should plan for the rates of new viruses coming forward down the road and the severity of those viruses? What lessons are we learning from COVID that are going to be useful to us as 10, 20 years down the road?
There's so much in that. There's so much in that question. And so a lot of full disclosure, my training is in neuroscience. And so emerging diseases is something that I'm still going to be learning about for the rest of my life, which is important because I learn about it every single year and learn more every single year for the classes that I teach. But it's also important to learn about it because this is something that it's not going to be I don't think this is the only time that we're going to see something like this. The ways in which we are interacting with the world and the ways that we are changing the world among our emerging disease researchers, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when is the next virus going to be coming coming into the humans. And so the helpful thing is that we have a history of a lot of different types of viruses that have done what we see with the coronavirus, which is to spill over. And when we talk about a spillover event, we're specifically talking about there was a virus or a pathogen that was present in animals. And for whatever reason, the animals were able to sustain that infection. In the case of coronavirus, we think that bats were probably involved at some point. If you've seen the movie Contagion, which I recommend that all of you see, aside from how quickly they get that vaccine going, that is an excellently well-researched movie that's worth your time, but only if you're feeling prepared to be scared out of your pants.
I don't think we should.
I don't want to watch that. This is a really bad idea.
Okay, all right. If you've got a morbid fascination with this,
There we go.
I've been going back and forth about whether or not Abby says it's a great movie. So
That is a great movie. It's a really good movie. I mean, I agree.
Going back and forth about whether or not I should have my class watch that movie because, like, my spouse had never seen it before, and like the first night of spring break, I was like, Kevin, we need to watch Contagion. He's like, what? And then at the end, he was like, anyhow, in Contagion, bats are involved, and the other species that we're really concerned about is pigs.
Yeah, sure.
Because bats and pigs, they're both mammals. So at the cellular, molecular level, our cells have some similarities. And you know, these red things that are on the outside of the virus there, those are called spikes. And those interact with our cells to do the work of getting into the cell to be able to do the replication. And they have to bind to something on our cells. And in the case of COVID-19, influenza, and measles, for example, there's almost a perfect match between those spikes and our cells. And so we know that there are mutations that happen that can change the way that these spikes are developed and how they can then interact with different host cells. And so, but we have a history of dealing with diseases that spill over. And to be clear, we're expecting that most of the diseases that we're going to be facing as emerging diseases over the next period of time are going to be due to spillover because there's such a diversity of viruses. So we have also a really interesting model to be thinking about, and upon which you know, a lot of the response to COVID-19 has been based. Well, we've got two actually. So we've got the SARS outbreak in 2003. We've got MERS as well. Those are both coronaviruses that were associated with similar types of symptoms. And so really we're using what we learned there to try and do better this time. And then we've got our yearly flu pandemic. Influenza, I was looking up the numbers from influenza, and right now the CDC is estimating that there's already been 50,000 some deaths, 30,000 to 50,000 some deaths this year due to influenza. And influenza is one of those diseases that we've heard of. Swine flu, H1N1, that's a zoonotic disease that spilled over. We also are concerned about avian influenza. That is another disease that we're really, really concerned about because it's much more difficult for the bird flu version of the spikes to attach to our cells. But if it does, it's disastrous for humans. So.
Hey, Rachel,
Yeah.
Can I jump in here? So George asked something in the chat, and I wanted to get that out and see what your thoughts are on this too, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yep.
So George asked the question: what is a reasonable public health time scale? Time estimates vary widely between those prioritizing the economy and those based prioritizing the healthcare system. I actually think that's an excellent question, and I mean I have my own take on this as well. But I mean, what are you thinking about that?
Ooh, yeah. I don't know that I have an answer to that, actually, because much of what I've been paying attention to, like deeply paying attention to, has been related to the molecular interactions of the virus with people and how we're managing symptoms. And so, I mean, that influences an answer, right? That we know that there's a certain window of time during which people are infectious, that we need to, that they're shedding virus and able to pass it on to another person.
Mhm.
I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective on this, what I default to is we need to be thinking about the scientific evidence and not so much about the economy per se. Um, when this all started, I had a somewhat different perspective, right? That yeah, okay, we know who's vulnerable. We should be doing everything we can to protect those folks, right? But in some respects, that's a very sort of optimistic view of people and their behavior. Ultimately, this economic activity, yes, it's slowing, but in my mind, the most important thing is that it slows across the board, right? Where I started to get really concerned, and again, this has to do with my focus on who is most affected by any sort of policy or action, is that at the end of the day, if we're all affected, that also creates this sort of social cohesion, ironically, among us all. I imagine and I always think about things like the Great Depression, right? When the people who went through the Great Depression, no matter where they were located socially, they all went through the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And that had an impact, actually a political impact, for at least, I think we think at least 3 decades afterwards, where people would commonly say, well, we're not going to elect these folks into office because they caused the Great Depression. And things like that. And that came across the board. Now that's for better or for worse, the situations, but I somehow feel better about that. But modern economies are also extraordinarily dynamic. And so I'm less concerned about their ability to bounce back. I mean, I myself, I've seen 2 massive bailouts in my lifetime that I was paying attention to. I'm thinking about the SNL loan bailout many, many, many years ago too. But that's why I don't worry so much about that. But when it comes to a public health issue, and something where we're trying to protect, and my son reminded me of this. He's like, Dad, if anyone's life is at stake, we should care enough to act. And I was like, you know what? You're right.
Well,
It'll be okay. Yeah.
I think that's actually, I appreciate you sharing all that, because it's actually helping me to think a little bit differently about how to answer Scott's question in the first place too, because this is the response to this particular outbreak is going to be studied for forever,
Yes.
right? It's the ways in which we get this right, the ways in which we get this wrong, the different approaches to control across the board. We have an amazing ability to do some pretty difficult natural experiments across the United States with the different approaches to controlling the outbreak and to controlling the spread of the disease, right? I think one of the other things that we're really able to do with this, related to this, figuring out what is the public health timescale, what is the appropriate way to respond to this, is that we are more connected now than we have been. So like the last big one, emerging disease epidemiologists talk about the big one, the next big one. TNBO, I think is what they actually call it. So, and the last big one was HIV and AIDS, right? And that was such a different pandemic, with the characteristics of that virus and the disease and the ability to spread it, the populations that it first showed up in, the ways in which our government responded to it or ignored it. I mean,
literally ignored it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm seeing some patterns here, but that's neither here nor there. Well, no, it is. Never mind. But the ways in which that spread across the world and remains a pandemic to this day, but with very different characteristics than it had back when it first started, right? Like every year when we talk about HIV and AIDS and emerging diseases, I asked the question of students, what do you think when you hear HIV and AIDS? And it's, even in the 6 years that I've been at Beloit College, it's shifted slightly from to, well, I mean, you don't want to get it, but it's manageable, right? Versus when I was in college in the early 2000s, it was a death sentence still, right? And so but there are very different characteristics of that particular virus. And now when we're dealing with a virus that, who knows, we might be able to be immune to it. You might be able to clear your infection, and we might be able to have immunity that lasts for a long period of time. And we might be able to then think carefully about the structures that we have in place for drug development and drug testing in a very different way. And so I think that the hard part about this particular question, Scott, is that we're so in the middle of it and so overloaded with information. And I personally am overloaded with like a deep-seated sense of existential dread, right? That makes it on some level hard to think about those things. But the good news is we have a lot of previous data to be working from here.
Yeah. So thanks, Rachel. And to backtrack just for a moment here, I mean, on the economic side of things, I mean, we've built an economy that to a large extent requires that people get together. And the only solution to the economic model is to create, is to get back to a point where people can actually interact with each other in a physical way. And we just do not have an alternative right now. Zoom is not it for the longer term. And but I'm with, I think Ron's take on this is about right, that if we can figure out a pathway to get back so that there are real life social interactions, physical social interactions that can continue to happen. And if we can do that at a pace, figure out a pathway to make that safe at a pace before all the small businesses go out of business with no ability to recover, then we'll bounce back quite rapidly from this. This at the end of the day, this is not 2008. A financial crisis is a fundamentally different beast than where we are right now. This is much closer to the crisis, the economic crisis that was connected to 9/11 than it is connected to the 2008. And we bounced back very rapidly from the 9/11 crisis. So
that's a really interesting context, Scott. I hadn't thought about that. I clearly haven't taken an econ course ever. But I think that's an interesting perspective, that this is even though it's worldwide and it's not like temporally contained right now, it will be temporally contained. It will be something that there is some, even if this becomes an endemic disease, meaning it's present all the time, there will come a point where we reach our new normal or return closer to the old normal. And that's, I think, fascinating to think about. Go ahead, Scott.
Yep, so I was about to ask, I'm really curious about some of the questions that came from your class, or whether there's other questions that people wanted to send in.
So sorry, I got booted there for a second. I don't know what happened. It was like, Ron, you got to go. Actually, Rachel, do you mind if I jump in on a question? Since Scott asked that, I've got one that I'm sort of itching to talk about.
Great, go.
So someone asked, what public health precautions could our government have taken sooner to prevent the panic or maybe the illness, right, itself, or the pandemic, if any? And what can we learn so far from this situation to prevent future outbreaks? And we've already talked a little bit about that, right? No matter how we look at it, this is going to be the lesson that we learned, right? I'll never forget, years ago, I was in a class on warfare. This was really years ago, and the professor said something there that I think somehow is still applicable here. He says, you know, national militaries and governments are always planning for the last war they fought. And for me, I think it's completely applicable here too, right? Because we run into this situation that no one expected, and now we're sort of writing the book on it. And part of me thinks, okay, that's fine, especially given the extraordinary reaction, and if it works, right? If we're able to really contain particularly the number of deaths and people who end up sort of permanently injured because of it, or even long-term injured because of it, then that means it's a win and we've got a pattern. But then I'm also reminded of 9/11 and what happened during 9/11. I'm gonna jump out here for a second. It's all right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened during 9/11 because some of you probably know, but we had an FBI agent who figured that something was wrong, who had the information in hand that there were these people who had come to the U.S., had learned how to how to take off in planes, and then quit before they learned how to land them. And she alerted her bosses about this. She said, hey, you know, I'm a little bit concerned. And she was ignored. And part of what gets me around that is that she was ignored in a context in which planners had considered the idea that planes could be used as weapons, right?
Yeah.
And so that's part of, I guess, what I'm really coming at here is that how we react going forward to the next outbreak really depends on a lot of characteristics, and one of those is our willingness to recognize that there may be some information out there that runs counter to what we want to believe, but that we have to nonetheless act on. And you know, again, that's been a challenge, and it was an open challenge for this administration, as we all know. And I think that this is teaching us, this COVID-19 experience is teaching us that we have to, whether we like it or not, we have to go forward with what the best evidence tells us, even if that is taking us to a place that says we've got to shut down the economy for half a year or something, right?
Yeah, I think that there's, you're right. What are the sources of information that we're paying attention to? And George has just asked a related question. Did we respond soon enough to the original reports in China? And I think that there's two ways to answer that, yes and no. I think that we know that China is a location in which we see emergence of diseases, in large part because there's so many people there. Wuhan is a mega city, a city of more than 10 million people. And when you put 10 million people, that many people living that close to one another, and they're doing the exact same things that we're doing every day, living with our animals and with one another, there's bound to be more exposure and more chance of disease. We follow what's happening with the flu every year. I've got a spider who's like just come down in front of me. So, so we follow what's going on in China with emerging diseases and with disease trends for that reason, because there are so many people who are living so close together, and they have actually the ability to monitor disease status there too. So the question of did we respond soon enough, I think that the CDC was very, very on top of this in terms of knowing what was going on in China. There were offers from the CDC to support the Chinese, offers from the CDC and the European Centers for Disease Control as well, to help China do the work, the epidemiological work to understand what was going on and how the disease was spreading among people. There's some, China clearly has a very different government structure than we do, and so that changes the way that they responded to those things. But whether or not we responded early enough to be aware and to protect ourselves in a connected global economy situation, I don't think we did that early enough. One of the early things that happened was there was a change, or the travel ban thing, where we basically said people from this area of the world are not allowed in. So early on, I think in February, we were, oh my gosh, it was only February. Okay. Early on in February, I remember there was a day where they were taking the temperature of people who were coming in through SeaTac, LAX, and I think somewhere in New York, because those are 3 or 4 different places where there's a lot of flights that come directly from China. But to actually pay attention to the movement of people who might have been exposed, we needed to be much more thorough. I think also there's a question of, did we respond early enough to original reports by preparing ourselves for it coming here? I don't think we did. We didn't. We saw the severity of the disease and the ways in which people were being affected by this disease and how quickly it was spreading through populations, and we didn't prepare enough. So I think one of the examples is the testing issue. We had enough time. The testing, for those of you who are in science, it's an RT-PCR, which is a reverse transcription PCR. We at Beloit College have the ability to do this, and you can run it in a 96 well plate, 96 reactions. It takes like an hour to set up, another 2 hours to run it. You get your results. That's technology that we could have ramped up production for way early on if we had been strategic about our preparation. And so we had enough time to make sure to validate those tests. Early on, there was a problem. The tests that were sent out from the CDC were problematic. They didn't work correctly. And so we had this time to be prepared, and we're not. And now we're struggling to keep up, and we're struggling to figure out the appropriate strategy. To be clear though, the strategies that we're using right now with social distancing and closing schools and moving to distance learning, like what we're doing here. My spouse works for ABC in town, and they've sent their people home who are working in the National Support Center. So they're working from home too. That's the right thing to do in this case. Yeah. The research supports this kind of non-pharmaceutical intervention when you're dealing with an outbreak like this. And so I think we are doing some good things, and the things that we're doing right now, I think, have the potential to really change the epidemic. But the soon enough question, I think overall, my assessment would be no.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a difficult point, right? On some level, you say, well, we should be forgiving of this, right? Because no one expected it, but that's not really true, right? I mean, people get paid to think about this. I mean, literally, right? To think about what can happen. What the issue is whether or not the political will exists to actually act on these these things when we see the first signs of trouble. And that's I think the harder question to address when we talk about an outbreak or any sort of other incident until it happens. Then once it happens, then we plan for it to happen again, right? And this is what that professor was getting at so many years ago for me, was that, you know, we're always, those large organizations are always planning for the last bad thing that happened or the last thing that happened instead of being sort of forward looking around it. That actually reminds me of something else. I was talking to one of my friends who is in Japan right now, and of course that's one of my sort of, you know, my sort of adopted second home, and it also is has one of the world's largest elderly populations. I think about 27% of the population now is over the age of 60.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it's pretty dramatic, right? And so of course I was really worried, and and asked him, well, what's the situation there? And we had a conversation there where he said, well, we hear reports every day of someone else who has contracted it or someone who's died, but it hasn't been this, it hasn't really taken off the way that we're sort of afraid that it would. And we had a little bit of conversation about why. And his idea was about, well, part of it is that, again, people, if the government tells you that this is what you need to do, people tend to go, okay, and they handle it and they just do it. But he said part of it also is that people don't tend to like hang out a lot with each other all the time, right?
Interesting.
And it sort of reminded me of a question that one of your students asked, and I thought maybe I'd sort of give my take on it, because they asked, well, what happened in Italy, and will we reach the same fate?
Oh yeah.
And I mean, of course, the potential is always there, right? But a lot of this does have to do with certain practices that are more or less common in different places. Something I was reading was talking about, like, part of the issue with Italy and again in Spain is that people tend to greet each other very robustly, right? So like, oh, hey, mwah, mwah, how are you doing? Giving people kisses and things, right? And when that happens in a context in which there's a highly infectious disease agent there, right? That changes everything. And especially if people don't recognize or are reluctant for whatever reason to recognize that they need to change their behavior. That's hard. And, in the US, we may be in some respects spared the same fate just because, we generally speaking don't greet each other in that way. Lots of people do live these sorts of isolated lives, and, we live in these big houses kind of away from other people. So it's possible, but that's not something that I wouldn't bet money that the situation wouldn't get at least somewhat as bad as Italy, for the very simple fact that we have a lot more people. And there is a lot less, what's the word I'm looking for, compliance with the sort of social distancing and the other sort of directives that are coming from folks. And that's what I think we really have to pay attention and be careful, because that's our potential cultural downfall, right?
Right. I think
is that we, it'll be all right, I don't care. Like, no, it won't be okay, and you better care.
Yeah, that was something that one of my other students in another class brought up. Like, there's such a big difference in the way that we in the United States view our individual health, view our individual role in society, and how our individual rights and needs supersede the rights and needs of the population.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of ways in which this is for many people an incredibly impactful study or impactful lesson in the fact that behavior changes health. Yeah. And behavior impacts the ways in which we interact with microbes. And the things that we choose to do and choose to not do as we're working with other people and being in spaces with other people matter for that. And I think that it's my hope that one of the outcomes of this is that we do recognize a little bit more, maybe, that personal experience of health is really related to the experience of those around us too.
Yeah.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that if there's any other questions from the audience or Scott, that we get at those. And I'd like to leave about the last 5 minutes for a final follow-up. What are you paying attention to in the next few weeks? So, but we'll take questions first. We'll give you a minute. And maybe there are no questions, in which case we'll throw it over to Scott for more questions.
I have plenty.
Oh, good. Maybe we can start on one of your questions, Scott, while we let everybody else kind of collect their thoughts.
Yeah, so a couple of times HIV AIDS has been brought up, and there's no immunization for HIV AIDS, right. But there is treatment. And one of the things that we've not talked at all about is how treatment is developing for COVID, and what are the prospects for some of the management of COVID to come from the treatment side of the equation.
Right. So the first thing to be aware of is that there is an active clinical trial, phase 1 clinical trial, meaning they're looking at the safety of the vaccine. This vaccine is really, really exciting because unlike a lot of other vaccines, so like when you get the flu vaccine, you're basically getting the virus chopped up into parts and your immune system responds to that. Or when you get the measles vaccine, you get what's called a live attenuated virus that goes into you, and it actually causes a little bit of measles, only it's not going to become, anyhow. You get infected a little bit, your immune system takes over, it takes care of it. This particular vaccine is a genetic vaccine, which means that you're being injected with some DNA that encodes the spikes, these red things again, on my viruses here. And your body makes the spikes and then has an immune response to it. So it's a really different way of thinking about it. And the benefit of this is that the development timeline is really short. And so phase 1 trials right now, which means they're just injecting it into a small number of people in Seattle, looking to see if it's safe, doesn't make them sick. Then the next round, they'll actually do a small efficacy trial that looks at, does it prevent coronavirus? And then they'll do larger scale testing. And that timeline is gonna, even if it's fast tracked, it's gonna take at least a year to 18 months. So the other way that we deal with viruses is through antivirals. And that's the primary way that people are treated for HIV and AIDS, is that we suppress the viral replication cycle. And there are some antiviral drugs that have shown to be promising for coronaviruses. And so we know a little bit about some of them. I think there's some, like, they all have these really spectacular names, Remvastavir or something like that, you know, and they usually have like a veer at the end of them, the names. But those actually basically stop your cells from making copies. There's one of the ones that I am not, or that I have special feelings about, is the anti-malarial drug, hydroxychloroquine. And I say this as somebody who relies on this drug to keep my lupus under control. That drug has shown to have some immune suppression features, and it also has been shown to interfere with viral replication under very, very tightly controlled lab circumstances with some questionable research around it, study design. And so that people are going out and depleting the supply of that particular drug is really problematic, because then it leaves people who are already having some problems without, or already immune compromised in a way because of their autoimmune diseases, without the ability to treat it. And so there's actually a number of papers that are reporting, or a number of papers that report that it's really dangerous to try and treat coronavirus with that particular drug. And so I'm more interested in the targeted antiviral drugs that attack or that address that particular approach. So we've got a question here. Ron, do you want to take this one?
Right. Yeah. So Alex wrote in and said, or made the question, or asked the question. The comparison has been made between COVID-19 and 9/11 in terms of effects on the economy. After 9/11, there also became a new normal for the civil liberties that everyday folks had. How might COVID-19 impact governmental policy in the future? I mean, I think this is an excellent question. I will say that even though I brought up 9/11 before as well, I brought it up in this sort of planning context. I do think that the events are sort of really different of a kind, right? In the sense that 9/11 was sort of ready-made for creating challenges to civil liberties, right? It had all of the sort of classic components of things that would be problematic in a society that has such issues with race and ethnicity like ours. And so between that and the sort of secret nature of and the clandestine nature rather of the events, both to trigger terrorist events and to stop them. I think that sort of gave itself to compromising people's civil liberties. And of course, many members of Congress found that they could easily sign, or at least in that context, could easily sign on to bills that did so. I think this is different of a kind in terms of that stuff. That being said, we probably haven't seen the full extent of the crisis yet here in the U.S. And it's been interesting to watch how assertive state governors have been, both in their declarations of things that fall short of emergencies, but that really are saying things like, shelter in place, don't do this and don't do that. And I think that's the change that we might see. As some of you know, in the U.S., based on the U.S. Constitution, healthcare and issues with respect to health have been traditionally left to the states. And this is the first time that I've been able to see any number of governors really step up to take this sort of leadership role here. And I think that the most likely impact, is sort of an obvious one from that, is that I think we'll see governors being much more willing to move into these sort of more dramatic steps in the future, like saying shelter in place or these sorts of things, even if they don't declare a national emergency. I think that's much more likely.
Ron, can I ask you both a question about this? Which
Say
is,
again? Go ahead.
Here's a related question. I mean, one issue that this may provoke is the role of government in requiring vaccinations.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Do you have a thought about the likelihood of this actually provoking a different type of policy than what we've historically seen in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially if we're able to come up with a vaccine that is highly effective and doesn't have the sort of side effects and concerns that so many people have, I think that's very possible. Again, I think it's going to depend, though, Scott, on the extent of the crisis, and that's unfortunate, but I think the reality. If next week, if everything suddenly calms down, I don't think so. Even if there's a vaccine, they'll be like, oh, okay, we'll go back to it's like the flu vaccine. You can get it or not, right? But I think unfortunately, if things really do sort of spike, I think you're right. I think we could absolutely see something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting. I'm regularly reminded of Rachel, who every time she's advertising for people to get a flu vaccination, says, if you want to see my daughter, this is the only way you're going to be able to do so. And
Yes.
And I feel a little bit, I mean, as someone who falls into the at-risk category with respect to COVID, feel a little bit that way myself, which is, you want to see me, and there is a vaccine that is available down the road, you better have had it. So
yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that as well, Scott, right? Because anyone who wants to see Scott, they're gonna have to get the vaccine. I mean, I'm not allowing you there. He's a treasure.
Yeah, I think that there's, we have a history, the government has gotten involved in, like, there's a Supreme Court case where somebody was forced to get the smallpox vaccination. I mean, I think that we're going to come up against that more often, especially as we see dwindling local rates of vaccination fall.
Right on.
So we've got one last question from Philippe. So this one's for you, Ron. Do the social practices in Italy that you mentioned also influence death rate? And why is Italy's death rate so high? Does the average age of the population factor into this?
So Philippe, that's a great question. And I'm not really a bench expert on Italy at all. But what I will say is maybe that's a question we can come back to and start off with next time. Let me do a little bit more research, but just off the top of my head, I might say yes, in the sense that the combination of, because Italy is, of course, one of the countries in the world that has this dwindling birth rate, right? And there's always the two sides of it, right? If you got a low birth rate, then you have a sort of, high level of graying of your population, right? That with the other social practices, probably so. Rachel, go ahead. You had something that
I actually just found a paper about this. The case fatality rate and characteristics of patients dying in relation to COVID-19 in Italy, where they do a bit of a comparison between the case fatality rate. So this is like the mortality rate of all the cases that we see in Italy versus China. And it pretty well follows that the older, so in the 30 to 39 range, the case fatality rate is 0.3%. In the 60 to 69 age range, it's 3.5%. These are similar to what was seen in China. And in the over 80 range, it's 20%. And so age makes a big difference. And so I'm going to share this paper with you, Ron, and I think that this is a great place for us to start for next week.
Absolutely. Let's do that.
So last thing, what are you paying attention to for the next week, Scott?
Oh, goodness. I mean, we're still in the early stages of distance learning, and we're going to get better and better at it. And so, of things that are really, really important is how we learn from each other in this moment of transition. And I think we're going to get better and better at learning from each other about how to handle the stress of the moment. So that's what I'm paying attention to right now.
Right on.
Great. Ron, what are you paying attention to?
The psychological and emotional health of the students, that's first and foremost. And then I'm paying attention to whether or not we start seeing a spike in cases, especially among those who are outside of what we thought was the high risk area or the high risk demographic.
Yeah, and so I'm definitely paying attention to the emotional health and well-being of my students, my colleagues, my family, and then I'm also paying attention to, give me a second here, and I will share this. If you haven't already seen this, the Johns Hopkins coronavirus dashboard, I check this multiple times a day. You can break it down by different areas of the world. You can see that this is the cases, the confirmed cases in the United States down in this corner. We have a nice epidemiology curve. So these are the new cases every day. I'm going to be watching for this to start to flatten out. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but that's what I'm paying attention to. So thank you everybody for coming. Please invite people next week. We'll be having Eric Boynton, our provost, come to talk. He is a philosopher, so he has another great perspective. Scott, it's great to have you here. Ron, this was wonderful.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, y'all.
Yeah, thank you for the questions.
Rachel and Ron, for setting this up. This is fantastic. Appreciate it.
And if you have questions, or if you have people who have questions, we are always looking for more things to talk about for this. Right now we're scheduled for once a week, and we'll talk about everything we possibly can. I'll talk about these things in my classes too. So anything that you're thinking about related to this particular situation that we're in right now, we'd love to talk about. So thank you, everybody. And I'll leave this meeting open for a little bit if there are any questions as you're leaving. And we're going to figure out with Whitney and communications and marketing where to put this in case you want to share it with people. So thank you, everybody.
Yep. Take care, y'all.
See ya. Thank you so much, Scott, Ron.
Yep.
Great.
Absolutely.
I think I count this as a success. So.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, this was good conversation, and hopefully next time we'll get even more people signed in.